Hey everybody, welcome back to the evening reading. Tonight we're gonna we're gonna weed. we're gonna weed. We're going to read from The Wisdom of Insecurity, A Message for an Age of Anxiety by Alan Watts. And the quick background on Alan Watts, if you've never heard of him, is that he was a very important philosopher slash, he would call himself an entertainer at times, um, who lectured widely on a lot of Eastern philosophical and spiritual traditions from the perspective of a Westerner. I believe he grew up in England. So to bring that kind of Western mentality to the Eastern traditions and then translate it in a way that, those in the West could understand was a pivotal, I think, transfer of knowledge in the 60s and 70s, and I think this book was actually written in the 50s originally. As a matter of fact, I'm almost positive that it was published originally in 1951. So the fact that the title, "The Wisdom of Insecurity: A Message for an Age of Anxiety," well, the age of anxiety, I guess, is still ongoing. So let's see what wisdom and insights he has to share. I'm going to read from page 39, which is a chapter titled "The Great Stream." A little water first. Okay. The Great Stream. We seem to be like flies caught in honey. Because life is sweet, we do not want to give it up. And yet, the more we become involved in it, the more we are trapped, limited, and frustrated. We love it and hate it at the same time. We fall in love with people and possessions only to be tortured by anxiety for them. The conflict is not only between ourselves and the surrounding universe, it is between ourselves and ourselves. For intractable nature is both around and within us. The exasperating life, which is at once lovable and perishable, pleasant and painful, a blessing and a curse, is also the life of our own bodies. It is as if we were divided into two parts. On the one hand, there is the conscious I, at once intrigued and baffled, the creature who is caught in the trap. On the other hand, there is me, and me is a part of nature, the wayward flesh with all its concurrently beautiful and frustrating limitations. I, which he puts in quotation marks, fancies itself as a reasonable fellow. So I fancies itself as a reasonable fellow and is forever criticizing me for its perversity, for having passions which get I into trouble, for being so easily subject to painful and irritating diseases, for having organs that wear out, and for having appetites which can never be satisfied, so designed that if you try to allay them finally and fully in one big bust, you get sick. Perhaps the most exasperating thing about me, about nature and the universe, is that it will never stay put. It is like a beautiful woman who will never be caught, and whose very flightiness is her charm. For the perishability and changefulness of the world is part and parcel of its liveliness and loveliness. This is why the poets are so often at their best when speaking of change, of the transitoriness of human life. The beauty of such poetry lies in something more than a note of nostalgia, which brings a catch in the throat. Our revels now are ended. These, our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air, and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. There is more in this beauty than the succession of melodious images, and the theme of dissolution does not simply borrow its splendor from the things dissolved. The truth is rather that the images, though beautiful in themselves, come to life in the act of vanishing. The poet takes away their static solidity and turns a beauty which would otherwise be only statuesque and architectural into music, which no sooner than it is sounded dies away. The towers, palaces, and temples become vibrant and break from the excess of life within them. To be passing is to live. To remain and continue is to die. Unless a grain of corn fall into the ground and die, it remains alone. But if it dies, it brings forth much fruit. For the poets have seen the truth that life, change, movement, and insecurity are so many names for the same thing. Here, if anywhere, truth is beauty. For movement and rhythm are of the essence of all things lovable. In sculpture, architecture, and painting, the finished form stands still, but even so, the eye finds pleasure in the form only when it contains a certain lack of symmetry. When, frozen in stone as it may be, it looks as if it were in the midst of motion. Is it not, then, a strange inconsistency and an unnatural paradox that I resist change in me? Sorry, I'm hunching here, guys. I'm hunching. Keep on forgetting there's a camera. Kind of. All right. Let's start that one over. Is it not then a strange inconsistent? Is it not then a strange inconsistency and an unnatural paradox that I resist change in me and in the surrounding universe? For change is not merely a force of destruction. Every form is really a pattern of movement, and every living thing is like the river, which, if it did not flow out, would never have been able to flow in. Life and death are not two opposed forces. They are simply two ways of looking at the same force, for the movement of change is as much the builder as the destroyer. The human body lives because it is a complex. The human body lives because it is a complex of motions, of circulation, respiration, and digestion. To resist change, to try to cling to life, is therefore like holding your breath. If you persist, you kill yourself. In thinking of ourselves as divided into I and me, we easily forget that consciousness also lives because it is moving. It is as much a part and product of the stream of change as the body and the whole natural world. If you look at it carefully, you will see that consciousness, the thing you call I, is really a stream of experiences, of sensations, thoughts, and feelings in constant motion. But because these experiences include memories, we have the impression that I is something solid and still, like a tablet upon which life is writing a record. Yet, the tablet moves with the writing finger as the river flows along with the ripples, so that memory is like a record written on water, a record not of graven characters, but of waves stirred into motion by other waves, which are called sensations and facts. The difference between I and me is largely an illusion of memory. In truth, I is of the same nature as me. It is part of our whole being, just as the head is part of the body. But if this is not realized, I and me, the head and the body, will feel at odds with each other. That one hits home. I, not understanding that it too is part of the stream of change, will try to make sense of the world and experience by attempting to fix it. We shall then have a war between consciousness and nature, between the desire for permanence and the fact of flux. This war must be utterly futile and frustrating, a vicious circle, because it is a conflict between two parts of the same thing. It must lead thought and action into circles which go nowhere faster and faster. For when we fail to see that our life is change, we set ourselves against ourselves and become like Ouroboros, the misguided snake who tries to eat his own tail. Ouroboros is the perennial symbol of all vicious circles, of every attempt to split our being asunder and make one part conquer the other. Struggle as we may, fixing will never make sense out of change. The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. I've got so many personal thoughts I want to share right now, but I don't want to get in the way of what he's doing. But suffice it to say, definitely learning how to join the dance and not try to control things so much. Still, religion, as most of us have known it, has quite obviously tried to make sense out of life by fixation. It has tried to give this passing world a meaning by relating it to an unchanging God, and by seeing its goal and purpose as an immortal life in which the individual becomes one with the changeless nature of the deity. Rest eternal grant unto them, O Lord, and let light perpetual shine upon them. Likewise, that was a quote, by the way. Likewise, it attempts to make sense out of the swirling movements of history by relating them to the fixed laws of God, whose word endureth forever. We have thus made a problem for ourselves by confusing the intelligible with the fixed. We think that making sense out of life is impossible unless the flow of events can somehow be fitted into a framework of rigid forms. To be meaningful, life must be understandable in terms of fixed ideas and laws, and these in turn must correspond to unchanging and eternal realities behind the shifting scene. But if this is what making sense out of life means, we have set ourselves the impossible task of making fixity out of flux. Before we can find out whether there is some better way of understanding our universe, we must see clearly how this confusion of sense with fixity has come about. The root of the difficulty is that we have developed the power of thinking so rapidly and one-sidedly that we have forgotten the proper relation between thoughts and events, words and things. Conscious thinking has gone ahead and created its own world, and when this is found to conflict with the real world, we have the sense of a profound discord between I, the conscious thinker, and nature. This one-sided development of man is not peculiar to intellectuals and brainy people who are only extreme examples of a tendency which has affected our entire civilization. What we have forgotten is that thoughts and words are conventions, and that it is fatal to take conventions too seriously. A convention is a social convenience, as, for example, money. Money gets rid of the inconveniences of barter, but it is absurd to take money too seriously, to confuse it with real wealth, because it will do you no good to eat it or wear it for clothing. Money is more or less static, for gold, silver, strong paper, or a bank balance can stay put. Sorry, what was the sentence? Money is more or less static, for gold, silver, strong paper, or a bank balance can stay put for a long time. Oh, I got it. Sorry. Money is more or less static, for gold, silver, strong paper, or a bank balance can stay put for a long time. But real wealth, such as food, is perishable. And man, do we know that in this current time. And toilet paper, too. Thus, a community may possess all the gold in the world, but if it does not farm its crops, it will starve. In somewhat the same way, thoughts, ideas, and words are coins for real things. They are not those things, and though they represent them, there are many ways in which they do not correspond at all. As with money and wealth, so with thoughts and things. Ideas and words are more or less fixed, whereas real things change. It is easier to say I than to point to your own body and to say want, than to try to indicate a vague feeling in the mouth and stomach. It is more convenient to say water than to lead your friend to a well and make suitable motions. It is also convenient to agree to use the same words for the same things and to keep these words unchanged, even though the things we are indicating are in constant motion. In the beginning, the power of words must have seemed magical, and indeed, the miracles which verbal thinking has wrought have justified the impression. What a marvel it must have been to get rid of the nuisances of sign language and summon a friend simply by making a short noise, his name. It is no wonder that names have been considered uncanny manifestations of supernatural power, and that men have identified their names with their souls or used them to invoke spiritual forces. Indeed, the power of words has gone to man's head in more than one way. To define has come to mean almost the same thing as to understand. More important still, words have enabled man to define himself, to label a certain part of his experience I. This is, perhaps, the meaning of the ancient belief that the name is the soul. For to define is to isolate, to separate some complex of forms from the stream of life and say, this is I. When man can name and define himself, he feels that he has an identity. Thus, he begins to feel like the word, separate and static, as over against the real, fluid world of nature. Feeling separate, the sense of conflict between man on the one hand and nature on the other begins. Language and thought grapple with the conflict, and the magic which can summon a man by naming him is applied to the universe. Its powers are named, personalized, and invoked in mythology and religion. Natural processes are made intelligible because all regular processes, such as the rotation of the stars and seasons, can be fitted to words and ascribed to the activity of the gods or God, the eternal word. At a later time, science employs the same process, studying every kind of regularity in the universe, naming, classifying, and making use of them in ways still more miraculous. But because it is the use and nature of words and thoughts to be fixed, definite, isolated, and I underline this part, so it must be important, it is extremely hard to describe the most important characteristic of life, its movement and fluidity. Just as money does not represent the perishability and edibility of food, so words and thoughts do not represent the vitality of life. The relation between thought and movement is something like the difference between a real man running and a motion picture film which shows the running as a series of stills. We resort to the convention of stills whenever we want to describe or think about any moving body, such as a train, stating that at such and such times it is at such and such places. But this is not quite true. You can say that a train is at a particular point now, but it took you some time to say now. And during that time, however short, the train was still moving. You can only say that the moving train actually is, i.e., stops, at a particular point for a particular moment if both are infinitely small. But infinitely small points and fixed moments are always imaginary points, being denizens of mathematical theory rather than the real world. I would make a point, but of course he's just about to make it. It is most convenient for scientific calculation to think of a movement as a series of very small jerks or stills. But confusion arises when the world, described and measured by such conventions, is identified with the world of experience. A series of stills does not, unless rapidly moved before our eyes, convey the essential vitality and beauty of movement. A series of stills does not. Hmm, Sorry, guys. A series of stills does not, unless rapidly moved before our eyes, convey the essential vitality and beauty of movement. The definition, the description, leaves out the most important thing. Okay, I starred this next part, so it must be really important. Useful as these conventions are for purposes of calculation, language, and logic, absurdities arise when we think that the kind of language we use or the kind of logic with which we reason can really define or explain the physical world. Part of man's frustration is that he has become accustomed to expect language and thought to offer explanations which they cannot give. To want life to be intelligible in this sense is to want it to be something other than life. It is to prefer a motion picture film to a real running man. To feel that life is meaningless unless I can be permanent is like having fallen desperately in love with an inch. Words and measures do not give life, they merely symbolize it. Thus, all explanations of the universe couched in language are circular and leave the most essential things unexplained and undefined. I think we'll stop right there. I think my only thought on top here, guys, is just that, in times of change, um, anxiety and confusion reign supreme. That is the default kind of mode our mind wants to slip into, and I know those states quite well. And I, have definitely been feeling a certain sense of um, both overwhelm and excitement during this time. Overwhelm because it seems like there's so much up in the air, but also excitement because it seems like a lot of our eyes and minds are open to new things and new ideas during this time. I think, which is a big part um, why I started doing these readings and other kinds of online events. Um, that being said, it has become so clear to me through the digital kind of medium that, as wonderful as it is to try to create more human connections through this medium, nothing compares to the real thing, right? Nothing compares to the one-to-one, face-to-face connections which we all enjoy and crave and need, since we are social creatures. So just sending a quick note of compassion and empathy to all those out there who are maybe struggling during this time. Um, Even though I'm, putting on my best face for this lovely reading, I definitely have my ups and downs too, and I hope everyone knows that they are not alone in their feeling, um, anything unpleasant. That's pretty normal, I think. So um, I will stop umming and ahhing and hop off. But that was The Wisdom of Insecurity, The Wisdom of Insecurity by Alan Watts. And yeah, highly recommended. Thanks, guys.